All right, well, hello everybody. Welcome into the season premiere of season 5 here of 3 Up, 3 Down. Our topic here today and for the next 3 weeks is going to be on the habits of successful plate umpires. So we'll get to break down some of the things that I think that we think that most successful plate umpires exhibit. Kind of break down that in video and some theories and things like that. So real excited here. Kind of moving away from the rule study, which was obviously our point of focus in the last several weeks. And probably more so to give you guys something to think about and potentially work on the diamonds. Now, before we go ahead and get in with announcements and things like that, to kind of preface this, and I'll probably say this over the course of the duration of today, we're going to give a lot of stuff with regards to strategy on the strike zone and things like that. So as we're going through things today, I think it is important to, yes, take it all in, but if you start to try and implement everything all at once, you're going to start to lose track of where exactly you may be. So, in the conversation here today and as we go through the week, just kind of coming to it, yes, with an open mind, but also with the realization that, number one, you're probably doing a lot of these things already. And then secondly, if you try and do everything at once, it's going to be a heck of a lot for you to go ahead and try and balance. You'll be all over the place and not feel as comfortable or confident as you may otherwise would. So that's a big topic and kind of a disclaimer here right out of the gate. Now, before we go ahead and talk about the strike zone strategy and things like that here today, just a couple of announcements. Obviously, Little League came out this week and talked about the cancellation of their upper level tournaments. It'll just be Little League Baseball and Little League Softball. Disappointing news, discouraging news for a lot of us. So I just encourage everybody to kind of rally around each other. There's a lot of decisions that have to be made by your fellow umpires, and obviously that in Little League Baseball. And remember, one of our point of emphasis here is to be a supportive teammate, and that's not only to the individuals that may have lost opportunity this year and have to wait until 2022 yet again, but it's also with the organization which we serve. So just keep that in mind here as we're moving forward. And people have to make some tough decisions, as we all have in the last year and a half. And Little League is obviously no different. And it's an organization that we all love. We all love each other. And it's going to maintain. And we just got to make sure that we stay together and stay united, as disappointed or discouraged as we may be. So lean on each other and find support in one another there. Secondly, that means then that 2021, as we've kind of talked about, is the year to really sharpen your habits and skills and fundamentals, so that when 2022 comes here now, all that stuff is second nature. So what a yet another great opportunity for us to continue to think about those focal points and things like that we've issued, to just really boil things down to the basics, as we're going to talk about here today. Pick a couple small things to work on, and you never know when those will pay dividends down the road. So really good opportunity in front of us here moving forward in 2021. Last announcement I've got is kind of more for the Central Region folks. If you guys saw on the Central Region Umpire Facebook page, Brian Wild and his alumni team have posted the alumni breakfast stuff for the week of the regional tournament. And although there will be no public attendance at the regional tournament, I think that situation will be separate. So take a look at our Facebook page for the flyer on that. John Ignacio and Brian Wild are the two individuals to contact with them. Again, that'll be completely independent of the regional tournament. There's no public attendance at the regional tournament. So if that factors into your decision to come and participate in Alumni Weekend, make sure that you're aware that there's no public attendance this year, unfortunately, at the regional tournament game. So those are the things here that I've got for us here announcement-wise so far for us today. Now, I'll go ahead and transition then into taking a look at the content for us today, and that is then on strike zone strategy. And specifically, we'll focus into two different areas. Number one, the importance of our pre-pitch routine, and then secondly, proper use of eyes, and how the two of those basically go together to give us strategy here. So that's exactly where we are headed here today. Now, I'll go ahead and get everything lined up here. Let me go ahead and share my screen with everyone here. So we'll get to the right page here for us. And then start to talk a little bit about this. Now, this, as I mentioned, is a three-part series. So here's kind of the three parts here for us. Today in episode 1, as I mentioned, it's all about strike zone strategy, specifically that pre-pitch routine and our proper use of eyes. Next week, we'll take a look at the efficient movements from behind the plate, which will be really interesting to see whether or not we're wasting or maintaining movements that are appropriate. And then last one, some game management strategies for us to talk about. So that's our three-parter here in May. Take the last weekend off as we all get ready to enjoy Memorial Day weekend. But that is what is in front of us here. Now, as I mentioned, strike zone strategy is our focal point here today. So the first thing that I want to do here as we have this conversation is think about the word strategy. All right, so that's where I want to start. And in talking about strategy, I think it's important for us to realize that a strategy, by definition here, if you looked it up, is just an action plan to accomplish a goal. It is an action plan to accomplish the goal. So the goal then here of our strike zone, many people would say, is to be consistent. And while that may be true, I would probably argue, and many theories out there would argue, is that maybe it's not consistency that we're after here in our strike zone strategy, but rather it should be accuracy. That's kind of the first thought or the first philosophy here behind this. Are we fighting for accuracy versus consistency? And ultimately, what many people would argue is that if your goal is accuracy, ultimately you are going to be consistent. So ultimately, the whole thought process here is that accuracy is more important than consistency here in terms of what exactly we're trying to accomplish. So that's the first kind of point here for us to think about as we start to think about strike zone strategy. Now, what the strategy relies upon is that action plan. So the goal, as I mentioned, is an accurate, fair strike zone. So in order to get there, number one, yes, you got to know what the strike zone is, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. But at the same time, our fundamentals have to set us up to be able to see the strike zone correctly. So the consistency at which we attack, the way we set up into our stance, and the way that we get in and set, that's going to affect how we perceive the zone and ultimately set us up to be able to call a fair and accurate strike zone. The second thing then here is the other point then that we'll talk about today, that's proper use of eyes. And that is what allows us then, and we'll talk about tracking and things like that, to process the information necessary to, as I mentioned, called a fair and accurate strike zone. But I think big picture wise for us moving forward, it kind of two things to think about here. Number one, strategy is an action plan to accomplish our goal. And our goal is a fair and accurate strike zone, more so than it is a consistent strike zone, because a bad zone can be consistent. So we're after a fair and accurate strike zone. And then in order to get there, our action plan is to be great in our habits of pre-pitch fundamentals. So that's our stance basics, and then be great in our use of eyes. So those are kind of the two different categories for us to look at. Now, as I mentioned before we started today, there's going to be a lot of things that we're going to throw out there here with these fundamentals. Some of us, this is second nature. So like just check it off the box that you're doing it. Some of us, we've got a lot to incorporate. So what's important to realize here as we start this conversation is that there's going to be a lot of information, and we want to take it all in, yes. But when you go back out on the diamond, you can't apply everything. It'll be like trying to do everything at once. You'll lose track of it and not be able to apply what you want to and not feel like you're making any progress. So I always tell umpires when they take a look at these things, pick one, two, or maybe even three. No more than three things to think about and try and implement as you start to work. Make those habits and then start to move on. So take some time, take it in, and again, one step at a time here as we talk about strike zone strategy. Now, pre-pitch routine is kind of the first element of strike zone strategy. Why is it such a big deal? Well, number one, it's what positions us successfully then and puts us in rhythm. And if our habits are great, then that gives us a chance to call a fair and accurate strike zone. But if our habits are not consistent with how we approach the strike zone, we don't give ourselves a chance. Obviously, many of you guys know that I coach basketball. And I coach college basketball at Denison University, and we talk a lot about our shooting habits and things like that. Well, if you think about a free throw shooter, he goes through a routine, and that routine puts him in a system of rhythm, of comfortability, so that his shot is consistent, that his mechanics are consistent, so that his shot is accurate. And that's exactly what we're trying to look at here with umpiring. So our approach to our plate stance has to be consistent. That's this pre-pitch routine in between pitches in order for us to be able to call our goal that fair and accurate strike zone. Remember, confidence comes from comfort, and comfort comes from our habits. So we've got to make sure that our habits and routines, the way that we step into the stance in between pitches, is probably the fundamental building block in order to have a good strike zone and ultimately call that fair and consistent strike zone, that fair and accurate strike zone that we're after. Now, I want to talk a little bit about our preset mechanics. So there's kind of four different areas here that we'll talk about in terms of building our pre-pitch routine. And the first one is, what exactly do you do in between pitches? So let's take a look here at a couple things here with regards to our pre-pitch cadence. Now, as I started to watch a lot of folks umpire, I kind of came away with three different preset positions. And this is what we do in between pitches. And what we do in between pitches has to be consistent because, again, doing so sets us up for the ability then to go ahead and call a fair and accurate strike zone. So there are people that may be the standing preset position. Some people may spread their feet first and then set and drop into their stance. Others then work hands on knees. And I've got some clips here for us too. So my question is, what exactly do you do in between pitches? And where does it fall in the realm of routine and consistency? Because remember, we want it to be consistent so that we have a better shot at calling that fair and accurate strike zone. So there are three different options. I'm sure that there's more that we can do. But again, the purpose of this is to kind of see, number one, just how well these umpires execute this fundamental, how consistent it is, and then that is what sets them up to be able to call a fair and accurate strike zone. So here's the standing set. The process here is that they're going to set the drop foot first. And the drop foot, in this case, is this umpire's left foot, the one that's closest to the hitter. You'll see this umpire sets this one first, and then sets he sets his slot foot. I'm talking out of turn. This slot foot, the one that's closest to the hitter. The slot foot, the one that's closest to the hitter. The drop foot, the one behind the catcher here. So we set the slot foot first, the one that's closest to the hitter, and then we set the drop foot, which is the one closest to the catcher. Now again, he's a standing set guy as we see this come about. Here again, he's going to stand right there. As the pitcher goes into his or her delivery, we set the slot foot first and then the drop foot. And you can see here the mechanics of this umpire are consistent on every pitch. Now also note where exactly he's lined up. He always finds himself lined up in the slot. Head height and everything else is typically great, and we'll talk about that stuff here as we move on down the road. But again, what's important to realize here is that this fundamental building block starts with what we do in between pitches. And this preset position of the standing set, exemplified by this umpire here, gives us a good idea of one way that we can be consistent in between pitches. A second example of a preset position we can use is our spread, our set, spread, and drop. So basically, we're going to set our feet, spread our legs, and then ultimately drop into our stance. So here is Seth at the World Series, at the Little League Softball World Series in 2018. You can see that he has set his feet, and again, he set his slot foot first, drop foot second, spreads out, and then he's going to drop at the proper time. And again, this is going to be consistent on every pitch. Here he is putting the ball back in play. You see that he's already spread his feet. So he set his feet and he spread his feet. He's ready for this one as we go to the next camera angle, and then he drops at the proper time. And again, these are all fundamentals in between pitches that we have to do in order to give ourselves a chance to be successful at calling a fair and accurate strike zone. New umpire, same routine, okay? Counts given, we spread our feet, we set our feet, slot foot first, then the drop foot, and then we go ahead and drop into our stance as the pitcher goes ahead and begins his or her delivery. There's another option of consistency in between pitches that allows this umpire to position effectively to position for a fair and accurate strike zone. The last one's the hands-on knees. A lot of people use this one and stay locked in. Some people readjust. Here's a good look at it. So we're hands-on knees in between pitches. This allows us to take a second to refocus and get back set. Hands-on knees there as the pitcher delivers. We may reset if the catcher resets. And then we drop back down by the time that the pitcher's free foot is back down on the ground. Another example here, hands-on knees here pre-pitch. The pitcher goes into his or her motion. We reset if the catcher resets, and then we're locked in here by the time that the free foot drops back down to the ground. Okay, so a couple different things here that we can do in our preset stance that have to be consistent in order for us to even have a shot at going ahead and calling a fair and consistent strike zone, or a fair and accurate strike zone. DJ, anything in the chat or anything like that here for us to talk about here so far?
Nope, all good. Keep it going.
All right. So that's the first kind of step, and the first thing to think about is what do we do in between pitches and how consistent are we in our preset? Because that preset, again, sets us up to be able to perceive the strike zone effectively from the right position. Now, we'll talk about the slot and slot positioning here as I continue on through things today, but we want to talk about building it from the ground up. So we started there with the whole idea of what do we do in between pitches to set us up. The second thing is our footwork. So we've got to make sure that we're aware then here of how we build our feet from the ground up. Now, I made this statement here, the slot foot and the drop foot. Which one should we place first? Well, remember that the slot foot is the one closest to the hitter. Okay, the slot foot is the one closest to the hitter. The drop foot is the one closest to the batter. I'm sorry, closest to the catcher. My goodness, I'm struggling today. So slot foot, the one closest to the hitter. Drop foot, the one closest to the catcher. So the question is, which one do we want to place first? And for the most part, the answer here in philosophy and theories out there is that we want to place the slot foot first, because oftentimes that results in us being more aggressive or better positioned in the slot. So many people want to set the drop foot first because they want to like split the back end of the catcher. Well, that doesn't necessarily do us any favors in making sure that we're in the slot, which is kind of that fluid midpoint between the batter, the inside of the batter, and the catcher. So we want to position that slot foot first. That'll get us lined up with the hitter, and then kind of find that midpoint, that nice midpoint between the hitter and the catcher, and then that's where we'll go ahead and find our slot. So we want to go ahead and position our slot foot first, and then go ahead and set our drop foot. And that then the reason why is because that has a tendency to make us more aggressive in the slot. Now, there are three heel-toe relationships to go ahead and form, and I'm sure many of us have talked about heel-toe before, and I've got a picture out there for us as well. The first one's with ourselves, and sometimes People want to work heel toe, which is fine. Sometimes we shorten up or kind of more parallel that stance to heel instep. That's acceptable as well. What we don't want to see is a super pronounced stance, because oftentimes that alters our squaredness to the release point of the pitcher, which affects depth perception, particularly on the outer edge. So we don't want to get any more pronounced with our feet in alignment other than heel toe or heel instep. And we'll see some examples of that here once I get to some of the videos. So that's the first heel toe relationship to maintain with our footwork, that with ourself, we want to be then heel toe. The other relationship here too is heel toe with the catcher. And this is to afford freedom of movement for the catcher as well. So if we take a look at the diagram, you can see the heel of the catcher. That's where our toe, our front toe, should be of our slot foot. Okay, and that gives us proper distance between us and the catcher and affords freedom of movement for the catcher as well. Now again, notice that our foot should be heel toe or heel instep, which means that our drop foot is slightly behind our slot foot. So our drop foot is slightly behind the slot foot. That means then that we're going to have freedom of movement here for the catcher if he decides to turn, throw the ball back, or turn and block something as well. So not only does that help us kind of perceive the strike zone in the slot, does that heel toe or heel instep alignment with ourself, but it also affords freedom of movement here with regards to distance of the relationship with the catcher. The last one's the heel toe relationship with the batter. And what we're going to see in some of these clips is that our toe of the slot foot should basically be lined up with the heel of the batter. The toe of our slot foot should be lined up with the heel of the batter. And that's going to allow us to be more aggressive in the slot. We'll see some examples and talk our way through that one here. Now remember, we want to build it from the ground up. So as we talked about with our pre-pitch routine, that preset, we focused a lot on the footwork. And the first step was always setting our feet first and then getting set or dropping into our stance. So in our presets, remember, we want to make sure that we are maintaining those relationships, those heel-toe relationships. Step in with the slot foot first, then the drop foot, so that we are more aggressive in the slot. Now, the last thing to go ahead and talk about here with regards to building it from the ground up is obviously the width of our stance. We don't want to be so wide or so narrow that our balance is off or that our mobility is off too. Our transfer of weight should not be side to side because we're so wide. It should basically be up and out so that we can go ahead and be mobile as well. And then remember, there are three of those heel-toe relationships, one with ourselves, our catcher, and then ultimately the batter, so that as we see here, we are positioned more aggressively in the slot. Let's take a look at some examples here of some umpires doing some really good work here with regards to the building stance from the bottom up. Okay, so a great look at this umpire here in this freeze frame, just in a great stance here. We talked about heel-toe relationship with the hitter. We'll see here that this umpire's slot foot, in this case, it is the left foot of the umpire here, lined up with the heel. Okay, and the batter obviously stepped because he stepped with the pitch. You can see the heel instep method here with this umpire stance as well. He affords freedom of movement with the catcher, and we'll see a back view of him too, where that distance to the catcher also affords freedom of movement as well. As we kind of watch this umpire, notice how consistent he is in this stance, in building it from the ground up. Again, take a look at his feet. They are heel-toe with himself. They are heel-toe with the catcher, which we'll see in just a second. And again, it is heel-toe with the batter. Notice that the slot foot, in this case, is the umpire's right foot on the left-handed hitter. This one then is lined up with the batter's heel, which positions him then in the slot, that fluid midpoint between the inside of the catcher and then the batter. And again, this is all a product then of what we do in between pitches, like we already talked about with our presets. Okay, really good look here at this umpire. Now, I'd show you the back view of this one. Again, a great look here at heel-toe relationship. Remember, heel-toe with the batter, that slot foot is aligned with the batter's heel, so we're in a good slot position, that fluid midpoint between the hitter and the catcher. We've got a good heel-toe relationship with ourself, so that we can have good depth perception on the strike zone, and we see it down and through the zone. And then lastly, we've got freedom of movement for the catcher. We're not all the way up on him, but at the same time, we're not too far back to distort our own vision of the strike zone and the outer edge if we ended up getting too far back. So a great look here at this umpire executing some of these fundamentals of building things from the ground up. And again, this is all a product of how we step in that preset. Now, I also mentioned that we don't want the width of our stance to affect our mobility. Here you've got an umpire who does a really good job of positioning in the slot. He just may be too wide. And if you take a look at like how he comes up out of his stance, sometimes he appears to kind of be anchor-legged, if you will. So we don't want to be so wide in our stance that we aren't as mobile as we may otherwise need to be. Remember, we don't want that transition of weight to be side to side. We want that to be up and out. That way we're more mobile here. And again, we don't want to get so wide that we may be lock-legged. Now, at the same time, this umpire does exhibit a lot of consistent fundamentals, which puts him in great position to see pitches. He is in the slot and things like that, just maybe a little bit too wide where he is not as mobile as we may otherwise want to go ahead and see. And if you take a look here, when the catcher hands him the baseball in the last out of the inning, he's kind of got to shift that weight from side to side, which may make us late to get out and rotate or whatever else the case may be. Likewise, we don't necessarily want to be too narrow. If we get too narrow, a lot of times here, our balance can be off, whether it's in our stance as the pitch comes in or as we're required to move after the pitch. We just want to make sure that we are as mobile as we can be, and we don't want to let our stance basically take us out of that mobility. So again, kind of the second step here is to make sure that we are, mobile enough within the width of our stance, and then obviously we're building that from the ground up. So step number one, what do we do pre-pitch? Is it consistent so that we have consistent perception of the zone? And then secondly, when we start to take a look at our feet positioning, we got to maintain those three relationships here with heel toe. Number one, heel toe with ourselves. Secondly, heel toe with the catcher. And lastly, heel toe with the hitter. DJ, anything in the chat here for us so far?
Eric made a good point, just reiterating the importance of making sure that the steps that you take are consistent and easily able to repeat.
Yes, absolutely. And I think, in working with a lot of young umpires, we can talk about being positioned in a slot and head height and tracking and this, that, and the other. The number one thing that I oftentimes try and focus on, particularly at umpire school and when I'm working with anyone, is just let's get them consistent in stepping into position, into that slot. And then, like everything else, head height, tracking, and things like that can come from there. Now, yes, those things are important. But again, to Eric's point and to the point that's being made here, if we can't step in consistently, then we're not going to have a shot at a consistent strike zone. And we can fix all that other stuff on down the road. So stepping in that pre-pitch routine and that footwork, I think, two really fundamental things for us to think about for us individually as we try and get better here in 2021. And then even as we're instructing, some things to think about too as we continue on down the road. Now, the last one here, or one of the other things here to think about in how we set up is the upper body here. And we talk about our shoulders in this case. And I made this point earlier. If we get too pronounced with the heel-toe relationship and try and work like what's called the super slot, where we're kind of trying more angled towards the outside corner, I think a softball calls it like I can't remember. Seth, you may remember this term, where you're square to the outside corner as opposed to the outside release to the release point of the hitter. A lot of times what that does is it distorts the outer edge, our perception of the outer edge. And we didn't necessarily find that out until a lot of people started to use what's called the colored plate drill. I'm sure some of you guys may have seen our videos from the Central region on the colored plate drill, and other people do the colored plate drills too. I mean, realistically, we stole it from other training advices as well. But what we saw is that people who worked that super slot, that more pronounced heel-toe relationship, oftentimes kind of had a distortion of the outer edge. They weren't tracking the ball, or they were seeing the ball as one color when the overhead camera actually showed it otherwise. So what we found here is that oftentimes that is because of the squareness of our upper body. And rather than being square with good pelvic alignment, as GPA is the term from softball, rather than trying to be square to the outer edge and having like a pronounced squareness to the outer edge, we want to be square to the release point of the pitcher so that we don't necessarily lose depth perception on the outer edge. And DJ, I'll let you kind of talk about your experience here in a second during one of our clinics here with Jose Matamoros and what he kind of talked to you about being square, okay? But if we take a look at this clip here of this umpire, he does a really good job of making sure, number one, that his cadence is definitely what it needs to be, but he is definitely square to the release point of the pitcher. He's got a great slot positioning, good mechanics. This is really strong umpire here that we see with regards to those fundamentals. DJ, anything else to add in there about your adjustment here with being square to the outer edge?
Yeah, the only thing is it's a matter of inches, honestly. But honestly, I can try and look for it and link it in the chat. But there's just a really good video of just kind of using that GPA and focusing towards the outside corner of the plate. But I was just missing pitches terribly, not even knowing it, but like, I would say about probably 3 or 4, maybe even more on the outside corner. But they were coming into me accurately. Made a turn and squared to the release point of the pitcher, like maybe a turn of 2 to 3 inches on my upper body. And it changed. Like the very next pitch, it changed. So it's the matter of inches and making sure that you're square to the release point of the pitcher is incredibly important. I'll try and do some searching here for that clip, and I can link that colored plate drill in the chat just to kind of see, because Jose gives a lot of really good input and feedback and teaching in that clip as well.
The last step here to talk about in our pre-pitch routine here. So we've kind of gone through three. Number one, what do we do in between pitches? How are we stepping in consistently? Secondly, our footwork, making sure that we have those three heel-toe relationships. Third one we just talked about was the upper body, as DJ just mentioned, being square to the release point to the pitcher. And then lastly, we obviously want to be set at the proper time so that we're not drifting and we're not moving as the pitch comes in. Now, the goal here of being set at the proper time is that we want to be set, or we want to be locked in. A lot of people use that word, locked in, by the time the pitcher's free foot comes back down and hits the ground. So we want to be set or locked in by the time the free foot comes back and hits the ground. So we are going to kind of go through this progression of how exactly we should kind of get set at the proper time. Number one, step in with that slot foot first. Remember, that allows us to be more aggressive. When do we want to step in with the slot foot? Well, if you remember from the clips, we saw them all step in as the pitcher toed the rubber. And we'll show some examples of that one here in a second. Now, once the slot foot is set, once the pitcher toes the rubber, you can set your drop foot. Okay, so you can set your drop foot second. Again, setting the slot foot before the drop foot is important because that makes us more aggressive in the slot, that midpoint between the hitter and the batter. Once the pitcher gets into the set position or raises the free foot, raises that non-pivot foot to begin the delivery, you can sink down into your stance. And remember that we want to be set by the time that free foot comes back down and hits the ground to deliver the pitch. That way we're set while the ball is in flight from the pitcher to the glove, okay? Now, some of you guys may ask what happens if the catcher adjusts. Well, remember, we adjust. So remember, the slot is a fluid midpoint between the hitter and the catcher. Now, do you have to adjust? No, you don't necessarily have to adjust, but as long as you maintain that midpoint, you're in good shape, and you don't want to necessarily overcompensate in the direction of the catcher. You'd rather probably overcompensate in the direction of the hitter. But nonetheless, if the catcher adjusts, we're going to go ahead and probably adjust with them, keeping that fluid yet relative midpoint between the hitter and the catcher. Now, the one area that we oftentimes get struggled in, I'm sure many of you guys are asking about, is if we get squeezed on the inner edge. And there's two different schools of thought. The kind of older and more writing principle in terms of how to deal with when your slot is squeezed on the inside corner is to go up but stay in. We don't want to ever go towards the direction of the catcher or outside of the catcher towards the outside corner. That's not the direction we want to go. We want to stay as much as we can in between the hitter and the catcher. So if our slot gets squeezed towards the inner half, a lot of people will say to go up, which is fine. And then the second step is to kind of go back like a half step as well to get you some vision there, at least on the inner half. And if the pitch is on the outer half, then that is what it is. A newer school of thought that is kind of more so with concussion protocol alignment there is to actually drop lower. And that whole idea of head height being at the top of the catcher's helmet kind of goes away at that point because more often what you're looking for is better vision through the strike zone. That's kind of a newer age philosophy that I've heard out there. More is definitely coming about with that one with evidence and people's experiences. But in the older school is to kind of go up and then back if necessary, if our slot is squeezed. Kind of the newer theory that's being tested out there right now is actually to drop a little bit lower, still in the slot. And as I mentioned here, we never want to go towards the outside. Okay, so that's what we do if the catcher adjusts. And remember, we want to make this adjustment before the free foot lands. Okay, so we want to make that adjustment before the free foot lands. Again, remember, we want to stand up and relax in between pitches, take a breath, reset, get your pre-pinch cadence in, think about that foul shooter shooting foul shots. You want to be in rhythm and shoot those in. Now, let's take a look here at some of these umpires who get set at the proper time, and we'll go ahead and wrap things up here shortly thereafter. So again, set at the proper time. The goal here, as it says here on the screen, is to be set by the time the pitcher's free foot lands. To be set by the time the pitcher's free foot lands. So remember here, step number one is to be our feet have to be in position as the pitcher toes the rubber. Here, says our umpire, feet are in proper position as the pitcher toes the rubber. As she goes ahead and lifts the free foot, you'll see that he sinks into his stance. He finds his lock-in mechanism before the time that the free foot lands, and then he is locked in and loaded for that entire pitch. Rick Strachey's our umpire here. Again, pitcher's on the rubber, toe in the rubber. We're going to get our feet set. And then as he goes ahead and starts his windup and lifts the free foot, we sink into our stance. Free foot goes to land. You can see that he's found a great lock-in mechanism and does a great job there. Okay. Again, same fundamentals here.
Hey, Stu, sorry, not to interrupt, but I have a question.
Go ahead, Noah.
Also, kind of what DJ was saying, when you guys were talking about squaring up with the pitcher's release point, DJ, I think you're squaring up your upper body. So sorry if I missed it, but so do you square up by just kind of like turning, your chest or your upper body, or are you moving your feet in order to then do that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Building, a great question. From the stance up, from the feet up, is essentially what we're building that squareness to the release point of. So, like, probably one thing, and I can go back to this clip here in just a second. One thing you may have seen in the umpire who demonstrated some really good fundamentals with being square is that his drop foot, the one closest to the catcher, was kind of flared down the line, and then that kind of squared him up naturally from his lower body up to the release point of the pitcher. So to an extent, yes, we talk about being square with our shoulders, but remember our feet have got to maintain that heel-toe relationship or that heel instep relationship first. Now we don't need to like turn our body to where we're uncomfortable, because if we're uncomfortable, we have absolutely no shot at calling a great strike zone. But definitely that squareness is something that should be consistent. And yes, we talked about it with our upper body, but it should be consistent with the entire body, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Yep. That answer it, Noah?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay, cool. Last one here to look at here in terms of being set at the proper time is using that hands on knees look here. So our hands are on our knees here. Pitcher's toeing the rubber, so feet are set. Catcher adjusts, so we readjust. The free foot's up, so now we're starting to sink into our stance. We are locked in by the time the pitcher gets his drop foot down, and the pitch is down in the strike zone. Same deal here. Okay, pitcher has just now lifted his free foot. We come up off of hands on knees, reset with the catcher. By the time that pitcher puts his drop foot, his free foot back down, we should be set, and that's exactly what happens in this clip. Okay. Now here's some clips of some guys basically trying to set too early. You can see how this probably gives us some instability in our stance. But not only does it create some instability, but it can also create some tunnel vision here as well. And then setting too late can sometimes cause us to drift. So setting at the proper time, really, really important here for us to think about as well. And when we want to make sure here, as we saw here, that we are set by the time the free foot lands. Okay, set by the time that the free foot lands. Noah, this is a really good look here at this still shot of this umpire in this picture. You can kind of see how his drop foot back here is kind of angled down towards the line, and how his whole body, legs, shoulders, waist, and everything else are square more so to the release point than they are the outer edge. This is a good still shot here, just randomly where it's at, for us to make sure that we see that point that you asked about being square to the release point. Last thing here to go ahead and talk about real quick, and then we're done here, is just to make sure that we review. And again, this is our pre-pitch cadence. I didn't get the proper use of eyes, so we'll have to table that for next week as part 2 here of our strike zone strategy. But again, a couple of real important things for us to think about. Number one, what do you do pre-pitch? In between pitches, what do you do, and is it consistent? And if it's not consistent, then that's something to work towards. And again, as you're working with some younger umpires and they're trying to build good habits, worry less about head height and tracking and things like that, and rather get them set into the right spot and then build that stance from the ground up. So what are we doing pre-pitch? Is it consistent? Because that's what gives us the best chance to be successful at calling a fair and accurate strike zone. Remember, we talked about footwork in those 3 relationships: self with heel toe or heel instep, the catcher to afford freedom of movement. Remember, we don't want to be any closer than the heel of the catcher with the toe of our slot foot. And then the batter, remember, we want to align so that we're aggressive in the slot. Our slot foot's toe should be aligned with the batter's heel. So those are the 3 heel-toe relationships we should maintain. Upper body and total body then should be square to the release point of the pitcher. And then we're set at the proper time, that we are locked in before the pitcher then plants that free foot. And again, those are kind of the 4 basic strategies in our pre-pitch routine that we've really got to fight for every single pitch. And in doing so, the rest will come together. Now, the second piece of this conversation of strike zone strategy is what we do with our eyes in pitch. So today, kind of focus more so on the pre-pitch stuff. And then next week, when we start to move on, we'll take a look then at proper use of eyes in pitch and how these two, our pre-pitch strategy, our pre-pitch cadence, and then the proper use of eyes combine together to basically formulate our strike zone strategy. And remember, that strike zone strategy is our action plan to go ahead and call a fair and accurate strike zone, a fair and accurate strike zone. Questions here before we go ahead and wrap up? Anything to touch base with here or anything like that in the chat, DJ, or anything there?
Nothing too crazy. Gary brought up some good points, but I told him we'd post game it after we finish this whole session.
Cool. All righty. Well, a couple things here in closing. First of all, once again, thank you for your attention. I know that there were a lot of things that were thrown out there. And I think a lot of things are definitely things that we've probably heard before and have been instructed before. But at the same time, as we start to help out other folks, and as we start to, think about 2021 as the year to get back to fundamentals and to rebuild those habits, I think it's important to kind of put into perspective a lot of those things and how integral they are at us actually being able to call a fair and accurate strike zone. And we're going to see that piece together more theoretically as we talk about strike zone strategy and proper use of eyes next week. So I think it's a really good building block. And as I mentioned and tried to say throughout the day here today, there are a lot of things out there for us to talk about today. You mentioned head height, slot positioning, footwork, pre-pitch cadence, and things of that nature. You really only want to take a look at one or two of those things and try and fix them and make them a habit before moving on to something else. So don't try and do everything at once, because you'll find yourself starting to unravel, and all of a sudden you're not comfortable and your strike zone probably will end up stinking anyway. So pick one or two of those things to focus on and get better at and improve here as you go ahead and head back onto the diamond. Last thing here for me, we've got the feedback form, post-game feedback form that's been circulating out around the region. Several people have filled that out, and I appreciate that one. It's starting to give us a list of some things to think about and focus on in our trainings. So we'll pump that back out in the recap email here as well. So please continue to fill that one out. Just trying to see, number one, what are you working on? Secondly, how's it going? And thirdly, what are you struggling with? So be on the lookout for that post-game feedback form as well. And then, as I mentioned at the start, tough week for everybody in Little League, players, umpires, volunteers everywhere. So rally around each other, support each other, be there for one another, and realize that, as disappointing as it is that we don't have 5 of our 7 tournaments at the end of the year, we're in with good reason. People are making good decisions for the betterment of young people, and that's just kind of where we have to be. So appreciate everybody here being here. Remember, part 2 of this series is next week. We'll take a look then at proper use of eyes in our strike zone strategy. Appreciate everyone being here. Looking forward to next week. We'll see you then. Thanks for being here, everyone.